It was just another morning. The bright studio lights reflected off the polished wooden floors, casting a soft glow on the faces of the crew. The cameras rolled, the audience murmured softly, and the familiar hum of morning television buzzed in the background. Mike Tyson, the legendary former heavyweight champion of the world, sat on a plush chair, looking calm, a little weary, but sharp as ever. He was here to talk about his new memoir and an upcoming Netflix documentary that chronicled his tumultuous life, his rise to fame, his fall from grace, and his eventual redemption. The host, a seasoned TV personality with a warm smile, greeted Tyson with his usual practice charm. "So, Mike, you've lived a life full of ups and downs. You've been to the highest highs and the lowest lows," the host said, looking directly at Tyson. "But today, we have something special for you. Something unexpected." Tyson, ever the enigma, tilted his head, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" The host didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned toward a producer, who stepped forward holding a cream-colored envelope, the kind of envelope that might be used for wedding invitations or the most important correspondence. It was sealed with gold lettering. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath as the host took the envelope in hand, carefully sliding it open. "This letter," the host said, his voice steady but with a slight tremor of excitement, "was sent from the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. It arrived just last night." The audience, already invested in the conversation, fell silent. Their attention was fixed on the envelope and then on Tyson's face. Mike's eyes narrowed as he looked at the letter. He could feel the weight of the moment. Something in his gut told him that this wasn't just any letter. His jaw clenched. "This is for you, Mike," the host continued. "Only you. And he said we could read it live, if you were comfortable with it." The silence in the studio deepened. Mike sat back in his chair, visibly processing what was happening. He wasn't sure how to feel. A letter from a foreign president? From a country he'd never set foot in? A man he'd never met? "Go ahead," Mike said quietly, the uncertainty in his voice betrayed by his now tensing shoulders. The host unfolded the letter carefully, the edges of the paper crinkling slightly. His eyes scanned the words, and then he began reading aloud slowly, as the room held its breath. "Dear Mr. Tyson," the host started. "My name is Ibrahim Traoré, President of the Republic of Burkina Faso. I am writing to you not as a politician, but as a man who, once upon a time, was a boy with nothing. I watched you fight, on a flickering television, in a room crowded with strangers. We had nothing, and yet there you were, fighting, not just for titles or money, but for something deeper. You fought because that was all you had left. And in that, I saw something that changed me." Mike leaned forward slightly, his eyes widening as the host continued reading. "You weren't just a boxer, Mike. You were proof that even the most broken among us can rise. That pain can be turned into power. When my country was in turmoil, I thought of you, of your eyes in the ring. Not the fists, but the eyes. The fire, the pain, the refusal to be defeated." Mike's breathing began to change. The weight of the letter, the sincerity behind it, hit him in a way he hadn't expected. The host paused for a moment, giving Mike a chance to absorb the words. But Mike couldn't speak. His throat was tight. His hands trembled as he gripped the arms of the chair. The host continued, the words now becoming more personal. "When I lead my people through difficult times, I remember you. You've taught me to rise, not as a fighter in the ring, but as a man in the world. Thank you, Mike Tyson, for showing me that survival isn't about the pain we endure, but what we do with it." The room fell deathly silent. Mike Tyson, the most feared man to ever step into the ring, was shaking. He hadn't said a word yet, but the tears were already welling up in his eyes. His gaze was fixed on the floor as he tried to process the flood of emotions that were threatening to overtake him. The host, aware of the gravity of the moment, placed the letter gently on the table in front of Mike. It was no longer just a letter. It was a bridge, connecting two men from different parts of the world, both scarred by life in ways no one would understand unless they had walked through the fire themselves. Mike wiped his eyes quickly, trying to regain some semblance of control. But it wasn't working. The tears kept coming. His body shook, not from the physical force of a punch, but from something deeper, something raw, something the world had never seen. He tried to smile, but it was forced. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the vulnerability of a man who had spent his life hiding behind the persona of the baddest man on the planet. "I was 14, Mike said, his voice cracking. Homeless, angry. I wanted to die. Nobody cared. I fought because it was the only way anyone would look at me. I wasn't a kid. I was just a machine, fighting to survive." The host was speechless. The audience, which had expected to see the usual brash, confident Mike Tyson, was now witnessing a side of him they had never seen before. A side that, until now, had remained hidden behind the persona of the boxer, the fighter, the champion. "And to know," Mike continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "that halfway across the world, someone saw me. Not the fighter, not the champion, but the boy who was just trying to survive." His words hung in the air, and the silence in the room became deafening. The most feared boxer in history was now the most human man in the room. The audience, the host, the camera crew, they all watched in stunned silence as Tyson's tears flowed freely. "I never thought someone would look at me like that," Mike said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I always thought I was just a monster, the guy who hit hard, the guy who didn't care. But this letter showed me that someone, somewhere, was watching. Someone believed in me." He paused for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He glanced at the camera, his eyes red and swollen. "And now, I believe in something else. I believe that pain can lead to something good. I believe that maybe, just maybe, I can do something for others. Because this isn't just about boxing anymore." The host, still trying to absorb the weight of the moment, placed his hand gently on Mike's shoulder. "Mike, thank you for sharing that with us. We can all see how much this letter means to you." Mike didn't respond. He simply nodded, his mind racing. The letter had unlocked something in him, something buried so deep that even he hadn't known it was there. A connection had been made, not through fists or titles, but through shared pain, survival, and the belief that even in the darkest moments, there's a way out. As the cameras cut to commercial, the crew stood in stunned silence. No one knew what to say. The air in the studio felt heavy, almost suffocating. In that moment, no one was thinking about Mike Tyson the boxer. They were thinking about Mike Tyson the man. And in that silence, something had changed. The world was watching, but Mike Tyson couldn't shake the feeling that the person he had been, the fighter, the monster, the terror in the ring, was gone. In the span of a few minutes, a letter had cracked through the armor he had spent years building, a wall so thick it had kept even him from seeing the real man beneath. What had just happened on live television had been more than a revelation. It was a reckoning, and Mike wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. As soon as the commercial break ended, the cameras returned, and Mike wiped his face. The tears had slowed, but the weight of the moment was still heavy on him. The host tried to continue with the scheduled questions, but Mike wasn't having it. His mind was a whirlpool of emotions, drowning out the trivial questions about his new book or documentary. He wasn't interested in that right now. He couldn't even focus on the applause or the studio lights. All he could hear was the voice of Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, echoing in his mind. Mike's entire life had been about survival. Survival in the streets of Brooklyn, survival in the prison cells, survival in the boxing ring. He had never known peace, never known love. He had been too busy fighting to prove himself, fighting to stay alive, fighting for everything and everyone who had never believed in him. But today, for the first time in his life, he realized something. He didn't have to fight anymore. The phone call came 2 days later. It was late at night, well past midnight. Mike had just finished a workout session in his gym, his body drenched in sweat, but his mind elsewhere. He hadn't slept well since the interview. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of that letter, the words that had struck him in a way no punch ever could. Then his phone rang. It was an international number, one he didn't recognize. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, Mr. Tyson," a calm voice responded, heavy with an accent that was familiar yet foreign. "This is Ibrahim Traoré." Mike's heart skipped a beat. He had known the letter was special, but hearing the man's voice, the man who had changed his life, in ways words couldn't explain, was something else entirely. "Ibrahim," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't believe this is really happening." "I understand," Ibrahim said softly. "But Mike, I have been waiting for this call. I know you have many questions, but I want you to know that your story, your fight, your pain, it has impacted more lives than you know. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across the world." Mike swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. The weight of the words, the sincerity, the depth of connection, it hit him hard. The man on the other end of the line wasn't a political figure. He wasn't just a leader. He was a brother. He was someone who had seen him for who he really was. "Mike," Ibrahim continued, "I want to invite you to Burkina Faso. Not for anything political, not for a speech or a meeting, but to show you something, to show you a different side of the world. I want you to meet the people who look up to you. People who have fought battles far worse than anything you faced. People who have survived the unthinkable." Mike's chest tightened. It was as if Ibrahim's words had unlocked something buried deep inside of him. He had always thought of himself as a product of his circumstances. He had always thought of himself as a fighter, a survivor, a man hardened by the streets and the ring. But now, here was a man from a completely different world, telling him that he had something more to offer. That maybe, just maybe, he was ready to heal. "I'll come," Mike said, his voice steady. "I'll come to Burkina Faso. I want to see it for myself." And so, just a few days later, Mike found himself on a flight to West Africa. The trip was spontaneous, unplanned, but for the first time in years, he wasn't worried about the next fight, the next media appearance, or the next big payday. He was focused on something else entirely, redemption, not for his career, but for his soul. When Mike arrived in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, there was no red carpet, no flashing lights, no photographers waiting to snap pictures. It wasn't about his fame. It wasn't about his legacy. It was about something much more raw, much more real. His arrival was greeted by children running alongside his car, shouting his name. They weren't cheering for the fighter. They were cheering for the man who had made it out of the darkness, the man who had turned his pain into something greater than himself. The first stop was the presidential compound, but it was unlike any political setting Mike had ever experienced. Ibrahim Traoré met him there, not with a firm handshake or rehearsed speech, but with a hug that said everything words couldn't. They didn't speak about politics. They didn't talk about the struggles of their respective countries. They simply sat together, two men who had fought their own wars, and for the first time in their lives, they didn't feel alone. "Mike," Ibrahim said, "I want to take you to a school." Mike followed him without question. They drove for miles through the dusty roads, past small villages, to a rural school on the outskirts of the city. The school was simple, walls cracked, the roof sagging in places, but it was alive with energy. Children sat on the floor, some writing in notebooks, others playing outside in the dirt. But it was the faces that caught Mike's attention. The smiles, the laughter, the hope in their eyes. One boy caught his eye, a young child, maybe 12 or 13, with a swollen eye and a torn shirt. He was sitting in the corner of the room, trying to hide his face, but his eyes were full of defiance. Mike approached him slowly, not as a boxer, but as a man who had been that boy once. "You fight?" Mike asked, sitting next to him. The boy nodded, his eyes not meeting Mike's. Mike smiled softly. "Me too," he whispered. "But you know the strongest punch? It's the one you don't throw." The boy looked up at Mike, his eyes wide with confusion. For a moment, they simply sat there, two souls connected by their shared experiences. Then Mike did something unexpected. He took off his championship ring and handed it to the boy. "You keep this for a moment," Mike said. "And remember, the strongest punch isn't always the one you land. It's the one you hold back." The boy's hands trembled as he held the ring. The weight of it was more than just physical, it was symbolic. The boy wasn't just holding a piece of metal. He was holding a reminder that even the hardest of fighters could be gentle, could show kindness, could be human. Mike glanced over at Ibrahim, who was watching them with a quiet smile on his face. "In this country," Ibrahim said, kneeling next to them, "you are not your scars. You are your spirit." Mike nodded. The words resonated deep within him. He had spent his whole life fighting, trying to prove himself, trying to escape his past. But here, in this small school in Burkina Faso, he realized something. Maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't what defined him. It was how he used his scars to heal. As the sun began to set, Mike and Ibrahim sat together on the rooftop of a building, overlooking the city. Ibrahim handed Mike a small box, and inside were dozens of letters from children across the country. They had heard about the letter Ibrahim had sent to Mike, and now they wanted to send their own messages of hope and thanks. Mike opened one of the letters. It read, "Dear Mr. Tyson, you are a lion who made it through fire. Please don't forget us." Tears welled up in Mike's eyes as he read the letter, the weight of it settling over him like a heavy cloak. This was more than just a trip. This was a moment of healing, not just for the people of Burkina Faso, but for Mike Tyson himself. He had come here to give hope, but what he had found was something far more precious: peace. Mike Tyson sat quietly in the back of the car as they drove through the heart of Ouagadougou, the capital city of Burkina Faso. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the narrow streets, but in Mike's mind, it was like the world had paused. The overwhelming weight of the journey, of the man he was and the man he was becoming, hung heavy on his shoulders. He had walked into this country unsure of what he would find, but what he had discovered so far was more profound than any boxing match he had ever fought. They arrived at a government building where President Ibrahim Traoré had arranged a small gathering. The walls of the building were simple, but its impact was undeniable. It was here, in this modest structure, that Mike Tyson began to understand the true meaning of his visit, not as a champion in the ring, but as a man in the world. He wasn't here to give a speech, or to take pictures for the press. He was here to connect, to heal. As he stepped out of the car, a crowd of people gathered, their faces a mix of excitement, curiosity, and respect. They weren't cheering for the boxer. They were cheering for the man who had survived, who had fought and fought through life's darkest corners and come out the other side, scarred but standing tall. Ibrahim Traoré was waiting for him at the entrance. The president's face was soft with a warm smile, and his eyes shone with the wisdom of someone who had lived a life much deeper than the title he held. He reached out to Mike and pulled him into an embrace. There were no speeches, no formalities, just two men who had fought their own wars, one in the ring, the other in the corridors of power, and had found solace in each other's presence. "Mike," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice full of meaning, "I've wanted you to see this, to see what your story means to people like us." They didn't need words to communicate. There was an understanding between them that transcended language, an unspoken bond formed in the heat of struggle and the fire of survival. Ibrahim led Mike to a small room, and the walls were lined with photographs, some of the president with his people, others of children in schools, farmers working in fields, and soldiers defending their homeland. But among these images, there was one photo that stood out to Mike, a picture of a young Mike Tyson, his fists clenched, his eyes burning with fire. It was a picture taken in the prime of his career, when he was still the most feared man on the planet. But looking at it now, Mike saw something different in those eyes, something he hadn't seen before. He saw a boy who was fighting not for glory, but for survival. "I'm not a president, Mike," Ibrahim said, breaking the silence. "I'm a man who dreams of peace, and I believe the strongest leaders are those who can understand the pain of the people. That's why I invited you here." Mike nodded, his throat tight. The weight of Ibrahim's words struck him harder than any punch he had ever taken in the ring. This man, this president, wasn't just talking about politics. He was talking about humanity. They walked through the hallways of the building, and as they passed an open door, Mike caught sight of a group of children sitting in a classroom. They were listening intently to a teacher, their faces bright with curiosity. Mike's eyes lingered on them, and something inside him stirred. These kids weren't just living through a tough situation. They were fighting to survive, just like he had. Ibrahim led him to a school outside the city. It was a modest building, with cracked walls and peeling paint, but it was alive with energy. The children were eager to learn, despite the lack of resources. They didn't have much, but they had hope. Hope that their circumstances wouldn't define them. Hope that one day, They too could rise above their pain, just like Mike Tyson had done. One of the students caught Mike's attention. A young boy, no older than 12, had a swollen eye, and his clothes were torn. He was sitting quietly in the back of the classroom, his head bowed, but there was a quiet strength in his gaze. Mike walked over to him slowly, not as a champion, but as a man who had once been that boy. "You fight?" Mike asked, his voice gentle. The boy looked up, surprised. He nodded slowly, his eyes not meeting Mike's. Mike sat down next to him. "Me too," he whispered. "But you know the strongest punch? It's the one you don't throw." The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment, the two of them just sat in silence. Mike didn't try to offer any grand words of wisdom. He just sat with him, in the quiet of that moment, knowing that sometimes the most powerful message was the one left unspoken. Then, without warning, Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out his championship ring. He handed it to the boy, who hesitated at first, his small hands trembling as he held the heavy metal in his palm. "Take this," Mike said, his voice rough. "And remember, sometimes the biggest strength isn't in the fights we win, but in the ones we don't fight." The boy clutched the ring to his chest, his eyes welling up with tears. It wasn't just a piece of metal to him. It was a symbol, a reminder that even in the toughest moments, there was hope. A reminder that someone, somewhere, believed in him. Ibrahim watched quietly from a distance, his eyes full of understanding. He knew what this moment meant. He knew that it wasn't just about giving a child a ring. It was about giving them something far more important, belief in themselves. Later that night, as the sun set over the African horizon, Mike and Ibrahim sat together on a rooftop, looking out over the city. Ibrahim handed Mike a box, a small, plain box that seemed insignificant at first glance. But when Mike opened it, he was struck by what he saw inside. Dozens of letters. Each one was from a child in Burkina Faso. Each one was a message of hope, of thanks, of inspiration. These children had heard about the letter Ibrahim had sent to Mike, and now they wanted to send their own messages back. They wrote about how Mike had inspired them, how his story had given them the courage to face their own struggles. Mike opened one of the letters. "Dear Mr. Tyson," it read, "you are a lion who made it through fire. Please don't forget us." Mike's eyes blurred with tears as he read the words. The weight of it settled deep in his chest. He wasn't just Mike Tyson, the boxer, anymore. He was something more. He was a symbol of survival, of strength, of hope. And this country, these children, they had seen that in him. They had seen the man behind the monster. He looked at Ibrahim, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I never knew I could have this kind of impact. These letters, they mean more to me than anything I've ever won in the ring." Ibrahim smiled softly. "That's because pain connects us more than fame ever could, Mike." Mike nodded, his heart full. He had come here to give hope, to inspire, to make a difference. But what he hadn't expected was to find that hope within himself, to realize that he wasn't just a fighter, but a man who had the power to heal, to change lives, to lift others up. And as he sat there with Ibrahim, reading letter after letter, Mike realized something profound. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the fights that defined him. It was the ability to rise after every fall. Mike Tyson hadn't slept in 2 days. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions and realizations, none of which he could fully process. He had always been a man defined by his ability to fight, to win, to conquer. But here, in the heart of Africa, he found something else, a new purpose, a new way to fight, a way that didn't involve fists or fury. The next morning, Ibrahim took Mike to a rural village on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a place that seemed worlds away from the bustling streets of the capital. The journey was long and dusty, and the roads were rough. But as they approached the village, Mike could already hear the sounds of laughter and excitement. It was a stark contrast to the pain that often filled his own memories. These were people who didn't have much, no wealth, no luxury, but they had something far more valuable: hope. The children in the village greeted Mike like a hero. They didn't care about his past or his accolades. They didn't know about his time in prison or his rise to the top of the boxing world. They only saw him as a man who had survived, a man who had fought his way out of darkness. And to them, that made him a symbol of strength, a beacon of hope. Mike couldn't help but smile as the children gathered around him. They were so full of life, despite the hardships they faced every day. Their resilience reminded him of his own youth, of the anger, the loneliness, the pain he had carried for so many years. But now, in their eyes, he saw something different. He saw peace. He saw the possibility of a future beyond the pain. Later that day, Mike sat down with a group of older students in a small, makeshift classroom. The walls were lined with peeling paint, the roof barely holding up against the weight of the weather, but the students sat intently, eager to learn. Mike couldn't help but admire their determination. They didn't have the resources he had growing up, but they had something he had never truly understood until now. They had hope. "Mike," Ibrahim said as they watched the students, "you see this? This is what your story means to them. You're not just a boxer. You're a symbol of survival, a symbol of what happens when you refuse to be broken." Mike nodded, his chest tight. The impact of his journey was beginning to settle in. He hadn't come here to preach or to give a motivational speech. He had come here to learn, to see the strength in people who had far less than he did, but who still found the will to rise every day. As he spoke to the students, Mike shared his story, not about boxing, but about the boy he used to be, the boy who was lost in the streets of Brooklyn, the boy who had no one to turn to, the boy who had turned to violence to survive, the boy who had no hope. "I didn't know how to be strong," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought strength was about punching harder than anyone else. But the real strength is in getting up after every fall. It's in showing up, even when you don't feel like it." One boy raised his hand, his eyes wide with curiosity. "But how do you keep going when everything is against you?" Mike took a deep breath, looking around the room. The faces in front of him were full of questions, of doubts, but also full of something he hadn't expected: trust. "You keep going because you have to," Mike said softly. "Because the only way to win is to keep fighting, even when it feels like you're losing. Every time you fall, you learn how to rise again." The room went quiet, the weight of Mike's words settling over the students like a blanket of understanding. They weren't just listening to a boxer. They were listening to a man who had survived the worst of what life could throw at him. And now, he was sharing that survival with them. Later that night, as Mike and Ibrahim sat under the stars, reflecting on the day's events, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. He wasn't just here to inspire these kids. He was here to heal himself. The scars of his past, the anger, the pain, it was all still there, but now it didn't define him. Now it was a part of his story, not the whole story. "I've never felt anything like this," Mike said, his voice quiet as he looked out over the darkened village. "These kids, they have nothing, but they have everything. They have hope." Ibrahim nodded, his gaze steady. "And that's what you gave them, Mike. Hope. That's what your story means. That's what you've become, a symbol of what it means to rise, no matter the odds." Mike smiled softly, his heart full. He had come to Africa to give something, but in the end, he had received more than he could have ever imagined. He had found a new purpose, a new fight, not in the ring, but in the hearts of the people who saw him not as a legend, but as a man. The journey was coming to an end. Mike Tyson had spent several days in Burkina Faso, meeting with Ibrahim Traoré, the children, the students, the people of this country who had nothing but had somehow managed to hold on to everything. It was a humbling experience, one that had shifted his entire perspective. He had gone from being a boxer, a champion, a symbol of power and aggression, to a man who had learned what true strength really meant. As the days passed, Mike found himself connecting with people on a level he hadn't expected. He wasn't just the feared heavyweight champion anymore. He wasn't the man who made headlines for his knockouts or his controversies. He was a symbol of survival, of redemption, of hope. And that message was one that resonated far beyond the boxing ring. On the final night of his trip, Ibrahim took Mike to a small village on the edge of the country. It was a long journey, but the landscape was beautiful, dusty roads lined with trees, fields stretching far beyond the horizon. The village was simple, but there was a spirit there that Mike could feel deep in his bones. These people didn't have much, but they had each other. And in that, they had everything. Mike stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the fields. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, answers, perhaps, or maybe just a sense of peace. But whatever it was, he felt it in the air. It was as if the very land had witnessed the struggles of the people who lived there, and had absorbed their pain, their strength, their resilience. As he turned to Ibrahim, Mike smiled, the weight of everything that had happened in the past few days settling in his chest. "I never thought I'd find peace in a place like this," Mike said softly. "But I have." Ibrahim placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. "You found peace because you've learned what it means to truly rise, Mike. And that is the greatest victory of all." The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village. Mike looked out at the horizon, and for the first time in his life, he felt content. He wasn't a boxer anymore. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, someone who had been broken, but who had found a way to heal. And now, he was ready to go back home. But he wasn't going back the same man who had arrived. He was going back with a new purpose, a new mission, to share the strength he had found in his own suffering, to show others that it was possible to rise from the ashes, to turn pain into something beautiful. As Mike boarded the plane back to the United States, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had gone to Burkina Faso to heal others, but it was clear now. He had been healed as well. He wasn't just a boxer. He was a man with a story to tell, a story of redemption, of second chances, of strength through suffering. And as the plane soared through the skies, Mike Tyson knew that his real fight was just beginning.